We are interviewing Edward Clark in the Town Hall of New Scotland near Albany, New York at 6:45 on July 9, 2004. He served in the United States Army September 25, 1961 through June 1963. Interviewers are June and Kenneth Hunter. Please tell us your name and when and where you were born.
My name is Ed Clark. I was born on Staten Island in New York City, and my date of birth was 9/9/36, September 9th, 1936.
And what did you do before you entered the Army?
Well, I went to school, and I was still going to school when I was drafted. I was in graduate school studying economics and accounting. I had just received a bachelor's degree in economics. And I was drafted suddenly because most people my age at that time who had been in college thought the draft was gone away, that it had pretty much served its usefulness and wouldn't go on anymore. And then the Berlin crisis occurred, and they, drafting people, realized that they might very quickly run out of eligible people if they didn't start scooping up the ones at the upper edge, the ones who were about to go beyond the age limit, which was people who just got out of college, who had gone through college being exempt and hadn't been bothered much since or heard much about it. So I went into the Army with a vast number of people who hadn't expected to get drafted, had been arranging their life just to go on as if there was no such thing as a draft, myself included. So we all went into shock for a while, and then realized we had to do it and turned ourselves over to the military. I was, let's see, I forget the name of the street, but I had to show up at an induction center in the lower Manhattan. I was processed. I went to Fort Dix. I served my basic training there, and then I was assigned to Fort Niagara. Because I had a degree in economics and accounting and experience in accounting, I was made an accounts clerk or an accounting clerk, an auditor of sorts. They had a name for it, but it wasn't auditor. But I was auditing non-appropriated funds. Those are things like the Officers Club and the NCO Club and things like that. Money that wasn't in the mainstream of the responsibility of the post you were on. It was their responsibility to see it was operated right, but they didn't pay too much attention to it as long as it conformed to all the rules. And that's what I did for almost 2 years. I got out 3 months early because my father passed away, and they sent me home, and the Red Cross made an appeal on my behalf to leave me there instead of going back in for an extra month or something like that.
What was basic training like for you?
It was okay. No, a little bit of a shock to your culture, what you're acclimated to. I was in fairly good shape at the time, so physically it wasn't demanding in my eyes. I could do my chin-ups and my push-ups, and I could run a couple miles with a pack and so on, which we had to do. In fact, I didn't mind it at all from that point of view. But the regimentation that was not familiar to me, I had to adapt to. But I had spent 4 years in ROTC in anticipation of becoming an Air Force officer. But I had failed the hearing test in the last year. I'm using hearing aids right now because my hearing has gotten continually worse since then. At the time it wasn't bad at all, but I couldn't pass the flight physical because of it. So I didn't want to put the time in that would be required if I was to just be an officer without being an aviator. I couldn't even be a navigator, which would have been a second choice and would have been acceptable to me. So anyway, I knew a lot about the military, and in Fort Dix I did all right because I understood their system. I didn't feel good about all that, being yelled at and everything, the way it happens. But we got along. I didn't mind basic. In fact, I met some people there that I still communicate with, that I actually think of as friends. You know, shared up and down bunk in the barracks and so on. And, we even went home with each other on weekends sometimes and visited each other at our different locations where we were stationed after Fort Dix. I didn't mind camp at all. One thing that came as a little bit of a surprise to me, while we were there, we were undergoing the usual training, you know, the crawling across fields under fire with barbed wire and everything. And they pulled us out one time, and that stuff was hard stuff, and it was very demanding. And they pulled us out one time, and it was very demanding. And they took us off the course one time because they wanted to send a class of ROTC officers who were now becoming officers through. And we were shocked to see how easily they took them through. They reduced the stress and the noise and the explosions and everything, and just sort of stood around while they stumbled through the course. Obviously just getting it over with without making sure nobody failed to get through. And at the same one time, at one part it was funny, and the other part, you know, it seemed rather inappropriate that the officers shouldn't be expected to be able to do what the men they're going to command were doing. So little mixed emotions about that sort of thing. With respect to the rest of basic training, I knew why we were there. They explained it, but for some people it was difficult to accept the idea that you obey unquestioningly. You do what you're told. Discipline, follow your leader was the thing they were trying to drill into you. You don't stand around and ask, why are we doing this, or isn't there a better way? You do what has to be done and do it immediately. And I understood that, and most people did, or at least most people I was with did. And so we went on and just went through the process for the time it took, and then went on to our assignments. So I didn't find basic training, the only thing about basic training and the Army, when you look back on it, is that since I went in not having expected to, I saw it as an interruption of my life that I was, you know, like rubbing up against and didn't care much for. I understood the need for it, but it didn't make it feel good. And for the entire time I was in, I wanted to get out and get on back to my regular life. And other than that, neither basic training nor the time in the Army itself was, as far as I was concerned, unduly demanding. In fact, it was sort of easy.
After completion of basic training, what was the next step? Did you go to any special military schools to prepare you for a future assignment?
None. I went right from basic training to the Comptroller's office in Fort Niagara, New York. That's all. It's the only training I got.
Describe some of the things that you did in your routine there in the Comptroller's office.
Well, you were assigned to a company on the post, and you had to do all the regular things that new recruits do, which is KP, peel potatoes, get up and drill in the morning, turn out on Saturday mornings or whenever they wanted you to rake leaves or clean, you know, do chores around the post, stand guard duty. They did training routinely through the time I was there for things like I would say emergency response to what did they call it? With chemical, biological, radioactive warfare drills to know what to do. And you rode around in jeeps with gas masks on and things like that, and learned the processes, the use of radios and so on. But there wasn't a lot of that. Mostly I sat in an office and did accounting or bookkeeping, and I knew how to do it. and so I did not find it that too demanding. I actually enjoyed it in the sense that I was working with a bunch of young guys like myself and with common interests and diversions and recreational interests and so on. So it was almost fun. if you didn't keep remembering that it just interrupts your life and you can't go on, it doesn't move you forward.
Now, when you went to Fort Niagara, that's in New York State?
Oh yeah, it's right at Niagara Falls, right above Niagara Falls at the mouth of the Niagara River, which flows south out of Lake Ontario into Lake Erie, and between the two lakes is Niagara Falls.
Now, did you have to do any kinds of special updating of skills, especially a weapons qualification?
Very little. In fact, I think we did once or twice, but I don't even quite remember it. Not much at all.
So you were quite fortunate to have the desk job, pretty much.
The what?
A desk job, working at a desk most of the time.
It was, well, fortunate in the sense that it certainly was safe, but I don't know that at the time I wouldn't have enjoyed driving a tank more, as long as I was driving it in the United States, The big concern for everybody was being shipped over to Germany, to the Berlin Wall, because at that time they were facing down the Russian, so one side and the Americans on the other. That wasn't the tanks I wanted to get into. And that's what they were preparing for in case there was a major confrontation there. So I was fortunate in that regard.
And you mentioned that you had a funny incident about raking snow off a park.
Oh yes, you always hear people talk about things that happened in the Army that could only be viewed as ridiculous or something like that because of the way things are done. And what had happened was, for some reason or other, they had failed. We had a beautiful park as an entrance to the fort, and just beyond the park was all the officers' houses and the post commander's house and so on, looking right down on the Niagara River. Beautiful place. And the commander, as he was leaving the post for some meeting, maybe in New York City, mentioned that no, you've never cleaned up this park. It's got a layer of leaves. It was late in the fall. I mean, it was winter coming on to winter, like November, maybe even coming on to December. And he said, I want that place cleaned up before I come back. Well, but as soon as he got off the post, it seemed it started snowing. And it snowed for a whole day. And there was a heavy cover of snow on the park, but he said, clean it up. So there we were out there, about 150 guys, or whatever it was, maybe it was 75, with leaf rakes, raking snow into big piles with the leaves mushed in among it. And they said, we kept saying, why are we doing this? This is crazy. Because the post commander said to do it. We're going to do it. Doesn't matter. And I mean, there were all kinds of foolishness involved with it. One young guy came out and he had this monster truck, big truck, the way only the Army can have a big truck. And he pulled up to the park and said, what do you want me to do? He said, I'm going to fill this with that pile, that one big pile, and there were 10 such piles. And he said, just back your truck right into it. And the driver said, it's going to go up to the axles. He said, just get the truck in there and get the snow out of here. Yes, sir, he said. Put it in gear and backed it in right up to the axles. And so they spent the rest of the day getting a bigger truck to come with more chains and haulers and things to get it out. And the truck driver just sat there as calm as could be, and said, when somebody said, why'd you do this? He said, he told me to. Talk to him. And that was it. I learned a little something about, bureaucracy in the Army and the hierarchical organizations right there. I mean, early on, I said, and he was a guy who was looking to make a career of it. He had no trouble at all doing what he was told, but refused to take any blame for the outcome. So, but in the end, that was just funny. I mean, of course, we laughed about it for days.
You had mentioned that when you went to college, you had taken ROTC
Yes.
courses. What was the realization of what duty would be like when you were going through ROTC and then when you actually were in the service, when you were drafted? Did they paint a different kind of a picture?
Well, of course, when I was going through ROTC, it was under the premise that I would be an officer. Of course, they painted a picture of an officer's life and a lot of spit and polish, but on the other hand, you were of a level in the structure higher than the masses of recruits and draftees and so on. I would have been in the Air Force had that worked out. Did I tell you this before or after? I mean, the reason I didn't go into the Air Force was because I failed the hearing test
Yes.
in my final year for flight school, and I didn't want to go in under any other conditions because it was a much longer commitment. So I chose to hope the draft wouldn't get me and wait it out, and I lost that gamble. But yeah, the picture they painted of the officer's life was significantly different, and indeed it would have been, as from what I learned in the Army. And nevertheless, that was it. They recruited people with college educations for officers' school, and I wasn't willing to pay the price of an added commitment of time.
Have you ever regretted that?
No. I regretted that I didn't qualify for flight school.
Right.
But
You
since I
mentioned
didn't, that was it. I didn't want to go any further.
that. And what person or people do you remember best from your days in the Army?
Oh, I remember a lot of them. I told you the story of our...
On your DD-214.
Yeah, I was reading and I do remember this gentleman, Lieutenant Colbert I. King, was the post adjutant. And I remember him well because he was a very intelligent guy, and he impressed me as a person who was responsible. And I had a good friend in the Army who was called Ira Backrack, who I remember well. He was a Jewish young man, married, and he and his wife had a child while we were at Fort Niagara. And so they wanted to have the Jewish ritual circumcision performed. They call it a bris. But they have to have what they call a minyan, which is a certain number of adult men there to witness it. Well, Ira couldn't round up 10 or 12 Jews at that time at that place. So Colbert I. King and I went down with our yarmulkes on and sat in on the minyan. And I remember that well because we were both looking at each other like, what's going on here? But particularly, I mean, I'm not Jewish, and Colbert is not only not Jewish, he's a black man, he's a African American, and that just went by the boards. It was fun. We ate a lot of fish, food, and things that the typical treats at Jewish ritual celebrations. So I just forgot all about it. And recently, this is 45 years later. I was reading a newspaper that had an article from the Washington Post, and it was a very good article, and about American foreign affairs. And then I got to the end, I saw the author from the Washington Post was Colbert I. King. I said, gee, that's a familiar name. And I looked it up, and sure enough, he signed my discharge papers. So I jumped on the internet and found the staff of the Washington Post, and there he was, Colbert I. King, and it was a black man, and older, so he was about my age or close to it. So I figured, I emailed him through the Washington Post, and it didn't take an hour before he wrote back and said, yeah, I'm the guy. I signed it, and asked me all about myself and whether I'd gotten back to the post at all, and I reminded him of the bris, the circumcision, and he said, I remember it well. He said, that was a strange affair for us. And so I reported back, and he mentioned that he's had 3 or 4 different careers, a banker, a foreign service staff member, and last year he won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism. And I looked again on the internet under the Pulitzer Prize and found him, and I read a whole series of articles he wrote. That was fun, and it was nice to be able to communicate with somebody, but I remember him. I remember mostly just guys I spent time with, and played ball with, and there was a Captain Young and a Major Grannis and stuff like that. What was interesting was that having picked off the last remaining people at the upper edge of the draftable ages, they wound up with a disproportionate number of college students, graduates. So you had kids come right out of high school who had no other prospects but to get in the service, and half of the other half were college graduates who never had any intention of going in the service, and it made quite a mix. Would you like me to over that shade?
No, that's fine.
Okay. And it created quite a morale problem, because at the same time, with these 2 groups that just didn't match well at all, jammed into barracks together and expected to work together and so on, they upped the time of the people who were in there, and so half the people in were raw new recruits, half of them were high school graduates, the other half were college graduates, and then the other half of the cadre, or whatever it's called, were people who'd just been extended for a year, and they were enraged. The morale was, it wasn't low, it was through the floor. Among that group, they were ready to go home, and were told, no, you're staying another year, at least. And that was, it made for some really funny situations. The discipline was just shot completely, because they just couldn't be threatened. They said, what are you going to do? Keep me in for 2 more years? They were just furious that it happened. And so they just tried very carefully not to break any laws, so they couldn't have to go to jail or anything. Most of them couldn't be demoted. There was, they were E3s and E4s and even some E2s. They were just PFCs. So they had no concern other than just hunkering down and waiting their year out. So that made it for a strange bunch of bedfellows. And what I learned from that, and one thing I did very seriously learn from the Army, was how to survive in a institutional or bureaucratic organization, one that runs under its own power regardless of the people in it, and how to get along in that atmosphere. And I did fine.
What was barracks life like? What kind of a routine did you have?
Barracks life was not was only familiar to me in basic training. I was married when I got to camp, and we had our own apartment. In fact, a very nice place on Niagara River, broken up, an old mansion, a house without buildings, and houses like that. Can I answer that, or is that? Let me just. Okay. What were we speaking of?
What was barracks life like? You said you
like
had
I said,
a place off the
I only
coast.
experienced barracks life in basic training, and again, it was nothing that for a person that age was unusual. Demanding. I just spent 4 years in a college dormitory. The only big difference here is you had to do work. You had to go out and run around and carry things and learn. They were always teaching you general orders and things like that. And I never found that. Most people didn't find that, hard. You know, they'd wake you up in the middle of the night and run you around so that you could learn that you had to respond when things happen, and if the whistle blows, you better have your feet on the floor and so on. That went on. You know, some people would call it harassment, but it's training. It's genuine training. I have no objection to it. It makes perfect sense that you need people who can jump. That's why you need young people who don't need 8 hours of sleep, who can skip a night even if they have to, or can walk 10 miles and get up and walk 10 more if they have to. And that's, so I was all in favor of it, and as I said, at the time I was in fairly good shape, and it didn't bother me. Food was okay, you know, acceptable. There was nothing about it that bothered me or surprised me. And my ROTC training, at least, I knew the marching stuff and the saluting. So I didn't make any mistakes and didn't get in any trouble. It was okay.
Now, what was the rest of the time like there while you were waiting to be discharged? You mentioned you got out early.
I got early out because 3 months because my father passed away of a heart attack, and I went home and I burned up all my leave and everything that was accumulated because my mother had no one else to care for her. I had a younger brother who was much younger, and so the Red Cross intervened. And in fact, I called them. They said, "Yeah, well, see what campaign." They just forgave me 3 months, and that, you know, it made sense. Otherwise, they would have had to bring me back to Fort Niagara, and then send me back home for literally just 3 months of duty, which obviously I wasn't going to get immersed in again in 3 months. So that was that. I mean, that was a nice accommodation, and it seemed to make sense. Nobody quarreled over it.
Have you had any occasions to get together with some of the old mates that you had back there at Fort Niagara?
I had one fellow who now lives in Canada. He moved to Canada for a work opportunity he had. He used to live in Boston. And yes, he and I have spent a lot of time together. After the Army, we got together, our wives, and we vacationed together once or twice and played golf and did things like that. We went to Boston. They came here to New York. And I still keep in touch with him, but not as well as I'd like to because he's in Canada. And if I ever get his email address, I'll pin him down and find out what we can do.
Now, since then, what have you done to get you to where you are now? You're now have the prestigious position as the supervisor for the town of New Scotland. In between, you served as the mayor of Voorheesville, and you probably had other elected positions.
No, I was the mayor of Voorheesville for 17 years. This is my third year, 2.5 years now. I'm in my third year as supervisor. I was once a trustee of the village of Voorheesville for 2 years. But I got there because after the Army, I went to work for the state of New York after closing up a business my father had, and that I had to take care of for my mother. I went to work for the state of New York and moved up to Albany, and had an opportunity to go to work for the legislature, the state legislature, and I did. And in the meantime, I picked up a master's degree in public administration. Compliments of the GI Bill, thank you very much, or whatever they call it now or then. And it was something I probably wouldn't have afforded to do otherwise, but all I had to do was put in the time at State University, and I did it. And so I developed over the course of time a great interest in local government politics in general. I went to work as a director of I started out in the Office of Research and Program Development in New York State Assembly. Minority, that's the Republican side. I chose that simply because that's where the job was available. That's when the Republicans were in the majority. It's ancient history now, but they were there then. And I later became the director of that office and worked for the state for 27 some odd years, and then retired. And then I undertook certain other private businesses, which I either tired of or they didn't work out the way I thought they would. But I just kept moving along, making a living, doing interesting things. And in the meantime, I became the mayor of the village. And then recently, in the last couple of years, having spent 17 years in that job, I decided that was a part-time job. I found myself without a full-time occupation, so I decided to run for supervisor of the town, something I always wanted to do. And there was an opportunity, a change of supervisors. The incumbent supervisor, who I had great respect for, was leaving. So I said, I'll give it a try. And I won. And then I won again next time. And here I am.
What are some of the kinds of things that you're called upon to do when you're in a political or a supervisor? Besides, we hear the meetings, and sometimes they're contentious, and other times they're easy and fast going. And
well, the major responsibility at this level of government, you don't establish or have responsibility for broad public policy. You predominantly have the responsibility for implementing public policy as it is articulated through either the law or by your own board concerning how they think it should be implemented. And that means, when you come right down to it, it means as much as anything else, just managing a good budget. And it's always been my idea that a budget for a town or a village is not much different than a family budget. You have to set priorities, and you have to work within your financial constraints, your revenue sources, and you can't just spend money and tax people. Well, I guess you could get away with it for a while, but that's not what you're there for. The idea is to provide good services and make them affordable to the people they're being provided to. You have to stay in touch with everybody. You have to know the whole town. You have to know all the people, all the different interests, and you have to respond to them. You have to know what people want.
When you were mayor of Voorheesville for 17 years, you've seen some tremendous growth in the village, particularly with the developments of the two developments there, Scotch Pine and Salem Hills. What was the general feeling of the old-timers there when these things were?
I don't know if you remember the history of them. They were there when I got there. They were there when I moved to Voorheesville. They were built in the 60s. And there's no question that there was a large degree of resentment towards them by the many old-timers. I remember going around running for election and circulating petitions, and one woman came out and said to me, I'll vote for an immediate neighbor, and said, well, I'll vote for you, Ed, but I'm not voting for anybody from Salem Hills. And actually, it's funny, you mentioned her son's name a little while ago, Bob Humes. It was his mother, Mrs. Humes. A great old lady, but boy, she didn't like Salem Hills at all. Why, I don't know. It was just,
new people coming in.
Keep things the way they are. Don't let anything get changed. And on the other hand, people had a right to sell their land, and people who bought it had a right to develop it as long as they followed the rules. And that goes on right now in the town of New Scotland. People want to maintain the rural character. They want the beautiful vistas we have, the escarpment. They don't want cell towers, but they want to be able to use their cell phones. It just goes on and on, trade-off after trade-off after trade-off. And everybody wants water, but they don't want development. If you're going to have water, you're going to have development. Like they say, the development follows the water lines. If you have water, you're going to get development. Around here, anyway. So those are the things you have to sort of feel your way through in this job, and that's why you have to keep listening to people and understanding what they want and find ways to get it done without being in people's face about it. without anybody feeling like their rights have been compromised or something like that. Not that it's directly related to what your interest, but New Scotland is the only town in Albany, in this ring around the city of Albany, that's still anyway rural. Bethlehem, Gilder, and Colony are just masses of urban sprawl. Why not? And we keep feeling the pressure.
What is a typical day like in the life of a supervisor?
The typical day is just to sit at a desk and answer the phone and answer questions with the people here, make decisions concerning services, what we should do. But a lot of the time it just comes down to deciding how the money's going to be spent and what we can afford. And, you know, is this what we intended when we wrote this budget? Or do we have to forego something because it wasn't in the budget and we can't take it from any other thing? The departments have to get their share of the resources so they can do their jobs. The public comes in constantly with inquiries, with maps of their land. They want to know what the zoning laws are. As you can see, I have maps all over the place. People want to know, can I do this? Can I do that? If I can't, why not? What do I have to do to get an exception to that rule? But I'm going to say that by and large, it's not the days, it's the nights. I mean, it's not unusual to have 3 nights out of a week, every week. I would say 3 nights out of a week committed to one meeting or another. It's not uncommon to have 4 nights in a week committed. It is uncommon to have no nights committed.
I suppose your accounting background sort of organized you, too, for all this.
That is true, but also the 17 years as the mayor, I had no problem with budgeting. I mean, I knew budgeting. There's differences in the town, but I was able to absorb the differences and integrate them into the, you know, the broader understanding that I had from 17 years in municipal budgeting at the village level, and then before that, accounting experience. That was very helpful. Numbers were no mystery to me, or funds, or balances, or spreadsheets, or any of that stuff. So I was fortunate. That made the job very easy for me to get acclimated to.
One of the crowning things that we remember when, after we moved here from a town not too far away, was one year it was announced in the village that there would be no taxes because they were so prudent in what they did. They went out and got some construction bids and so forth and found it was too high and that they could do it on their own, and that was one of the things that really astounded us, to find something like that happening, which was so unusual.
Yep. You might lead us off in a whole different subject here, because one of my favorite subjects is village government and vis-a-vis town government, and why it is so much easier to run a village than a town financially. If you do it frugally, you know, with analysis of costs and policies concerning spending that are frugal and take into consideration only what's needed rather than giving everybody everything they want. The year I became mayor of the village, there were no taxes, no village taxes. But in Albany County, that's easily explained, the sales tax. You know, we were getting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of sales tax that we had never gotten before. It just kept building and building and building. It's just, and even in recent years, in the 90s, it was just, the town now gets $1.6 million a year in sales tax. This year, we're getting several hundred thousands of dollars in mortgage taxes because of the number of mortgages being refinanced, number of houses being bought and sold. All that produces revenue that the community gets a piece of. So, you know, That's, it's not a matter of just taxes. It's a matter of revenue sources from outside the taxes. And a village has the advantage that because it's very compact, it's much easier to serve economically. Nothing is spread out. The town, for example, has maybe 10 to 15 times as many roads that it has to maintain and plow and pick up the garbage on, and so on and so on. It has thousands and thousands more parcels that have to be assessed. The village doesn't have to assess, the town only has to assess. And on all these differences that mostly have to do efficient to run a village than a town. We have 18, 19 people on the public works crew. The village has 5. So I mean, there's a big difference right there. Well, maybe they only have 4 now. I don't know. 4 or 5.
Gee, how would you like to do New York City?
That's different, right? You're right. No, that's different.
Yeah.
But the big cry now in local government is commercial tax base. And that isn't because of the towns and the villages, it's because of the school districts. The schools are becoming so fiercely expensive. Everybody says we need good education, but the cost is becoming monumental. And if you don't have a commercial tax base, a tax revenue source that doesn't contribute to children to the school district, after a while it becomes very, very difficult.
Anything else?
Now, looking back on it, would you do anything different that you've done in the past if you had the chance?
Wow, that's a tough question to have to come on. Anything different? Take a few more risks. Yeah, I would. Let me ask, would I be able to know what I know now? Or would I have to start with a fresh slate? Because that would make a big difference. I'd probably take a few more risks, jobs, trade, do what I want to do a little more instead of just trading off with what was a sure thing. Take a chance instead of just make sure. But on the other hand, you have a family, and what are you going to do? You have to take that into consideration.
Now, we ran across each other many times when we had a job. The state was facing a crisis at one time with low-level radioactive waste. Many people were in favor of disposing it elsewhere, but it was always not in my backyard and go elsewhere. And what were your feelings on that? Was this a big problem or not?
I thought it was a big problem. I had the sense, after listening to many of the experts, that it could be handled correctly. I also had a little ambivalence about it because what I call the Schoharie Creek Bridge syndrome. You remember that?
The bridge that collapsed?
The bridge that collapsed in a tremendous storm. It was an piece of engineering perfection when it was built, and it should have lasted 300 years. And it lasted like 35 years. And without any warning, during a tremendous storm, it collapsed and people were killed. Now, if you had asked any civil engineer how had that been done wrong, they'd say, no, it was great, it was perfect, it was terrific. But human error, to some degree, allowed it to deteriorate. It wasn't inspected correctly, perhaps, or they hadn't measured the amount of erosion that, So as years passed, the care given to its security was not as great as was anticipated when it was built. And I say, that was what I saw when I listened to the people who said, not in my backyard. And I'd say, geez, their fears are unreasonable, way, way out of proportion to the risk involved. Then I think of the Schoharie Creek Bridge. I'd say, but on the other hand, the experts are saying it can be done. Well, he said the bridge wouldn't fall down either. And that always gave me sort of an ambivalence about it. You'll probably remember the meetings we attended together. These were meetings of the people who were making the decisions about the disposal of the low-level radioactive waste. And it's important to remember this is a low level. We're talking about medical waste and things like that as much as anything. And we went to meeting after tedious meeting of people saying the same things over and over again. And my favorite story about that is when somebody asked me, how do you like these meetings? I said to them, well, I had a visitation from an angel the other night in my sleep. And the angel said, Ed, your time is up. You have to go to the great beyond now. And I said, what's going to happen to me? And he said, well, maybe you have a choice. He said, really, you haven't done as well as you should have, and you're going to have to go to hell. But because you have done some reasonably good things, we're going to give you a break. So we're going to let you stay on Earth here longer, as long as you keep attending the low-level radioactive waste meetings. And I said, Mr. Angel, to tell you the truth, I'd rather go straight to hell. So, and that's how I felt about that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this interview and our
This is great.
time
I
with you.
enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you.